Hi, this is Paul. I wanted to do a quick video. Might not be quick. Words that fudge. Literal. Literal has become a very fudgy word. Now, the second month in a row, I'm going to pick up on Jonathan Pajot's December Patreon question and answer. And I feel bad for John because he's an artist and he's getting a pastoral question. So let's hear what this person asks him, because it's a good question.
Okay, so how do I explain to my friends and family in a succinct way that I believe in religion, but that I don't think heaven is a literal place? Seems very nuanced, and that I'm playing word tricks to an onlooker. I'm having a hard time articulating that obviously Santa Claus is real. Obviously Santa Claus exists in a way that makes sense and doesn't make me sound crazy. Any advice?
It's Jonathan drinking.
I'm gonna say that it's tough. I think it's tough that if you're trying to explain it to Mormons, I think it's really tough.
The person asking the question is a Mormon, and they explained that too. And Mormons, well, I'll talk about that as I get into the answer.
Because Mormons do believe in that God. I mean, I don't know. I'm not a Mormon, but
okay, it's helpful to remember when and where the LDS Church arose, which was in what was called the Burned Over District. That was upstate New York. And the two Great Awakenings had burned through that district of upstate New York. And the reason it was called Burned Over is because no one else could be saved. And because everyone was saved, and everyone was so saved that, in fact, what you had was a whole series of sects that grew out of that area. The Oneida community that I talk about in a number of videos was up there. The LDS group grew out of there. Jehovah's Witnesses, the Millerites, a lot of groups grew out of there. There was an intense millennial fervor that grew out of that region. But now what's important to remember is when these groups started. Now these groups are starting in the 19th century, and you're getting peak modernity in the 19th century. So there are some very materialistic philosophical assumptions that are deeply embedded in the culture and the language that regular people are not going to be aware of. One of the interesting things in this particular question and answer that Jonathan is dealing with is the question of symbolic language versus, well, there's the thing, because human beings naturally work symbolically. And that's really what Jonathan has excelled at in terms of exploring that and articulating that and trying to articulate that. Now, the difficulty is that symbolic language for a certain class of people, and Jonathan explains this a little bit later in the video, symbolic language for a certain class of people has become a foreign language, but not really. They still deal with symbolism and metaphor on a daily basis. They're just not aware they are doing it. And that is this naive use of language that we all have. When you're raised in a language and a culture, you have a naive use of that language and the culture, and you just use it. Now, when you have a boundary area like symbolism versus, and we're going to use this word literalism, because that's symbolic versus literal. That's the pairing, okay? Or metaphorical versus literal. That's the pairing. A couple of videos ago, I mentioned that language as a residue of the 19th century positivism, we began to imagine that language always relates just to one thing. So here's a cell phone. Here's a cell phone holder. That language has like this one-to-one relationship. And whereas that's certainly true, but language more works in terms of relations with each other, especially when we get into complex and difficult concepts or ideas that can't be nailed down to one specific thing. Paul VanderKlay. To the best of my knowledge, I am the only Paul VanderKlay on planet Earth. I am the only Paul VanderKlay that spells his last name the way I do in all of human history, partly because Ellis Island made some decisions that got put into the stream, and so the way I spell my name is unique. Now, I dare bet it may not be that way, but when you say Paul VanderKlay, it refers to me. But right away, things can get complex because how long am I me? so on and so forth. But the language is always working in concert with other words, all right? So that kind of positivism that was present in the culture got built into LDS theology. And they were trying to articulate within their worldview their ideas. And so then you wind up with God living on planets, because this is the 19th century. They're aware of planets. For the 19th century, you're on a globe spinning. The earth is spinning around the sun. That's in the 19th century. If you look at the first chapter of Genesis, it's a table with a dome. That's the cosmology of the ancient Near East. Now, the difficulty we have when we came into this literalistic frame was that, okay, you had this fight that was brewing in the 19th century, the modernist fundamentalist fight that both of which, remember I talked about the fork, both of which had the assumption down the shared part of the fork that they're not paying any attention to, because they're paying attention to this part of the fight and they're not paying attention to the shared part of the fight. And so all of that is built into the LDS church. And so you have a literal father. Well, now we need a literal mother, and God on a literal planet, and the deified children of God, quite literally. And so all of this language takes on a literalistic framework that makes a lot of sense in the time and space in which the religion emerged because of the particular cultural context. Now, they also tended to, if you read their scriptures, they tend to, I hope no one takes offense at what I'm about to say, but I remember when I read the Book of Mormon, and I thought, boy, this sounds a lot like the King James Bible. Doesn't sound like the Greek. Doesn't sound like the Hebrew. Sounds like the King James. It's because of when it emerged from. Now, you also have to understand that the LDS Church has a view of mechanical inspiration. So Joseph Smith, using the seeing stones, wrote down, transcribed what was on the plates of gold. That's all built into the cultural conception of that time and place. And that's why this word literal is really important and problematic. And now Jonathan is going to try to wade into this briar, and let's see what he does with it. Poor Jonathan.
What I understand of Mormon teaching is that Mormons do actually think that God is like on another planet, or that something like that, or that when you die you go to this planet in the cosmos, and that you're kind of on this planet, and then you can also you can become a god, and then you can create a world, and then those people are going to go on planets. And so it's very, very, it seems very materialistic, at least in my perception. I don't know if that's totally a good understanding of it. But I think that the only way, I think, to help people understand that heaven isn't a literal place in the sense that it's a
and right away a whole bunch of evangelicals just got ticked off. This is the problem with this word, and we run into it all the time because of the 19th and 20th century modernist fundamentalist fight. But okay, Jonathan, keep going.
It's a place like your house. I mean, like I said, it's going to be tough if you're talking to Mormons. I mean, I always ask people, because people will say crazy things, like people will say, Christ. Okay, so here's a good way. Now, everybody uses the word spiritual, okay, and so
don't use that word. We're going to have to use it, but that's the first word that fudges, and now we're on to the second.
Maybe try to get people to explain to you what they mean by spiritual.
Right, because people have very different meanings, and it's important for them to understand what they mean by it. Chances are, again, they're using it naively, and I don't mean that pejoratively. I just mean they have assumed conceptions of the word that they're bringing to the use of the word, and it's within that context that they're trying to employ it.
because usually people will say something like spiritual is non-material things, or something that's not material. Okay.
Right. So we have symbolic or metaphorical being paired with literal. Now, and again, this is what I did a video a little earlier today that I'm going to post before this one, where I get into Plato and the forms with VanderKlay. I always want to say Verkijk because it's more Dutch. VanderKlay walks through Aristotle, and understanding what he says when he walks through Aristotle is so helpful to figure out a lot of these dilemmas. This formal cause, which is lost to us, but it's a super helpful concept. So you've got symbolic versus literal, and you've got, at least in many people's conception, material, and you don't really know what we're saying when we're saying that, and spiritual. And as a pastor who works in a church, anyone who's been in my Sunday school class, well, I've trained them now for years, but if they throw out the word spiritual, I'm going to stop them in their tracks. I'm going to tell them, I'm going to ask them to define it, and they can't. And then I'm going to poke around in their minds, in their worldview, and try and locate this word for them. Same thing goes for literal, because so then suddenly you line things up. You say, okay, material, literal, metaphorical, spiritual. Those aren't bad pairings, but again, things get slippery fast.
And so maybe try to get them to talk a little bit about what that means, like what it is, what is spiritual. And so once you start to kind of talk about what something spiritual is, meaning that it's not physical, then you can try to say something like, well, the word spiritual, it just means wind. It just means...
I really don't think this is going to help your Mormon friends. This is so hard.
And so when you're talking about these spiritual things, do you think that they're in your physical breath? Do you think that, like, when I blow on someone, that I am that's what it means by spiritual something?
See now, and we've talked about principalities and powers, and I think we've really made some good progress thinking about principalities and powers, and thinking about, well, I don't have any Apple devices here. I've just got a few in my, but there's the principality and power of Apple, and he started talking about principalities and powers a little bit earlier in this video. So now you're connecting, and Jonathan is exactly right, because in terms of the language, these things all line up. Ruach, the wind was over the waters in Genesis 1. And you read a Christian translation of the Bible, the Spirit. And again, if you watch my Sunday school class, I pay attention to what's in translations, and I often line the translations up next to each other, and I pay attention which translation is capitalizing what. Now, most of the time when people are reading the Bible, they just blow right through that. There's a different word, different use of blow. They blow right through that, but you really can't, because you have a capital S or you got a small s. Which spirit are we talking about? What in fact is a spirit? Jordan Peterson in the Ben Shapiro, Dave Rubin talks about this spirit under the world. Talks about the spirit of masculinity. And as he talks about that, and he as he frames it sufficiently, we begin to get an understanding of spirit, and we can begin to get an understanding of what spirit is. Now, again, I go back to C.S. Lewis's book Miracles, and C.S. Lewis notes that right now spirit is dominating the use of my hands, and spirit is colonizing and controlling the use of this computer. Well, what do you mean spirit is? Well, this thing that is Paul VanderKlay, this story, this process that is moving through time, that is Paul VanderKlay, that has personhood and identity and volition and will. this spirit is moving these hands and picking up this Logitech trackball available on Amazon.com. Boy, I'm lining up sponsors like crazy. Show me the money. Patreon's going belly up. What's a YouTuber supposed to do? This is too much fun. So then you throw in the word literal, and it doesn't reside well in that universe. And this is where Jonathan is stumbling. And I'm not going to pretend that I'm going to somehow make things crystal clear. I'm hoping I can make a contribution to it, because it is, again, it is really hard. And as a pastor, and this is where Jonathan's an artist who's moonlighting as a YouTuber. I'm a pastor who's moonlighting as a YouTuber. As a pastor, I pay very close attention to hear how a lot of people use language, especially certain of these terms like literal and spiritual. Because remember, I said spiritual and metaphorical. They clump those things together. Then you had material and spiritual. They clump those together. So suddenly they're aligning literal and material, and they're aligning metaphorical and spiritual. And again, those aren't bad pairs, but you've got to slow down and pay attention to the detail, especially when one of these words, that fudge, comes down towards you in a sentence, because, boy, I'll tell you, you're going to get hung up quickly, because you're talking to Mormons and you say, I don't believe in a literal heaven. Boom! You've just walked into the minefield in no man's land of the modernist fundamentalist fight that is still with us and is embedded into the LDS experience and embedded into their theology. That's why it's handy to have Christian traditions that predate this. And Jonathan's tradition, the Orthodox tradition, is very old, and the Latin Roman Catholic tradition is very old, but we are not very old. And so you'll find, I dare bet, others who have appropriated now these conflicts, and they're at work in their world today. Well, let's let poor Jonathan finish up.
And most people will say, obviously, no. And then you can try to help them understand. Well, you think that, like, when I blow on someone, that I am that's what it means by spiritual something? And most people will say, obviously, no. And then you can try to help them understand. Well, it's because when you blow, that's also speaking is air. That's
okay. When you blow on someone, a person, most of the people in our culture are going to understand that in multiple ways. Okay, so you're standing next to someone and you blow on them. What's going through their mind? First of all, if you ask them to describe this, now I'm going to introduce a word here that I think is really helpful in this conversation, physically. They will say, you have expelled air molecules through your lungs and they have now passed across my skin and I felt it. Now, let's say I'm standing next to a person. I'm a big guy, okay? Let's say I'm standing next to someone and I want to intimidate someone. I was a campus cop in college. And so, I used to play a lot of those intimidation games because I had no real power, but my goal was to get students who weren't quite sure of the power I had to do what I wanted to, which was usually cough up their alcohol. Because it was a dry campus. So I stand over someone and I breathe on them. Okay, what does that mean? Well, now we're dealing within a relational space. And there's a physical aspect to it. I'm large. I've got a big nose, and my beak is looking down at you, and I'm breathing on you, and I'm leaning over you, and I say, open the trunk. And one of the things I learned as a campus cop was sometimes give people a short, direct, quick command, and they'll kind of bypass their reason, and they'll do it. And so they'll open their trunk and there'll be the beer and I'll pull it out and I'll pour it out. And they'll be all ticked off because this poor college student just spent their money on beer and I just poured it in the parking lot. And they're not happy with me. But I've always had a thick skin. So what's in the breath? Well, I just moved air on them. The wind was blowing. That didn't make any difference. But because I'm large and because I was wearing a uniform and because I was leaning over them and because I breathed on them, well, suddenly, was there something spiritual happening there? Well, yeah. So something physical happened, and now I'm going to add another word that's hopefully going to clarify a little bit. Something relational happened. Now, I'm going to line up physical over with material and literal, and I'm going to line up relational over with spiritual and metaphorical. But all of this is all connected. And so in that moment, the physical and the relational leaned in to cause something to happen. Plus, it was a Christian campus. The person probably is feeling a little guilty about smuggling their beer onto campus, and they didn't know what I couldn't do to them and how much trouble they would get into. So there's lots of layers all happening here at the same time. How can we talk about the kinds of things we read in the Bible when in the Bible God created the heavens and the earth, and things have multiple meanings? So the heavens, what do we mean by the heavens? We mean this blue sky above us that has clouds and it has stars, and that's where God lives. And so Jonathan Pageau is really terrific as, where's God? Ask a child. Up. Where's the bad place? Down. Now this is built into us in ways we don't fully understand. Now, again, I've told this story in previous videos. The cosmonauts go up and they look up into the heavens and they say, oh, there is no God. And C.S. Lewis comes back and says, you don't look for God that way. Oh, what do you mean? How can we think about this? And C.S. Lewis employs Dorothy Sayers' terrific illustration that I keep reworking with Tolkien and say, well, here's the question. If you're Frodo and you're looking for Tolkien in Middle-earth, where will you find him? Well, one hand you could say you won't find him. J.R.R. Tolkien is not in Middle-earth. What do you mean he's not in Middle-earth? Well, he's kind of in Middle-earth. He's everywhere in Middle-earth. And I talked to I can't remember his name, Benjamin Boyce. I talked to Benjamin Boyce, and I actually use this in some other conversations really. Tolkien is in a sense everywhere in Middle-earth. He's in Gandalf, and he's in Aragorn, and he's in the map, and he's in the orcs, and Tolkien is all over the place. But Tolkien is not in Middle-earth the way the cosmonauts imagined they could find God once they get up out of the atmosphere. And Mormons will know this. Christians will know this. And so that's when people start trying to appropriate scientific words to try to make sense of it. So it's in another dimension. Okay, well, what do you mean by that? Well, I don't know what I mean by that. I just found that word and thought that would be cool because I saw it in a Star Trek show. Okay, fine. That's the way you're using it. Okay, let's get back to this word literal. Literal, metaphorical. You're killing me, literally. Boy, we're fudging up that word bad when we use it that way. And Saturday Night Live and Mad TV, they've done, I don't remember one of them, I think Mad TV, used to have this regular sketch on there. When I say you're killing me, literally, you're using literally for emphasis. And that fudgy use of the word is indicative of what happened in the 19th century with respect to the modernist fundamentalist feud, which in fact was something that was building in through the Reformation and on past it. And this is why Jonathan Pageau's commitment in terms of the Orthodox faith is really interesting, and his practice as an icon carver is really interesting, because something's going on in language. Because when we connect literal with, well, you're killing me, really. What do we mean by that? We mean really. Is it just in terms of intensification? Yeah. But what we mean is that what's snuck into the language is that the literal is the real and the metaphorical is not. But we actually don't talk that way at all. Let's look at some other things which again in our materialist frame have no essence because they have no matter. Let's look at a marriage. Okay, what is a marriage? Well, you say, well, there's a marriage license. Well, the marriage license isn't the marriage. It just bears witness to the marriage. Well, what is it? It's a relationship. It's a relationship between two people. Is it real? Oh, yeah, it's real. It can be a very real thing. It can make your life really happy. It can make your life really miserable. And if you violate it, your spouse will tell you. Okay? It's a very real thing. Is it physical? Well, you express your marriage physically, but it's not physical. You can't point to it. In one video, I think it was a meetup or perhaps that I said, would anyone name their marriage? And that actually wouldn't be a bad thing to sit down, because if you name it, you're actually categorizing it. Maybe that's one of the things that you and your spouse should negotiate. Jordan Peterson did a little thing with Dr. Oz with a couple in trouble in their marriage, and I won't go there. I've got a lot of thoughts about that. But so, does marriage exist literally? See, now I've just messed you up, because we so quickly take literal, material, physical, and we line them up. Does marriage exist physically? Well, you'd say, well, there's a physical expression of it. Yeah, there's a lot of physical expressions of it. There's physical expressions of it all over the place. Does marriage exist spiritually? Well, now people are kind of stuck, because some people who are comfortable with the word spiritual will say, yeah, I can see that. Other people will say, they'll get nervous. Again, these words are very deep, and they're tying into very deep things, and they're very slippery right now in our context. So then we get to the question, is the Bible literally true? Well, of that sentence, the Bible is not a non-complex, but the easiest thing to identify. True, well, which conception of truth do you mean? Literal, well, what people mostly mean is that when blind Bartimaeus was outside of Jericho, what did Jesus say? Well, right away you've got the synoptic problem, because there's the synoptics disagree on that. Well, what are you going to do with that disagreement? And in fact, it's not just in the synoptics. These kinds of things run through the Bible, and then people will point to that and say, aha, inconsistencies, therefore not true. Well, Genesis 1 has this vision of a firmament, which is like a bowl, and then I'll ask people, and people will get ticked at me sometimes and say, well, where are the sun, moon, and the stars, above or below the firmament? And if they'll read it carefully and they say below. Okay, what's above the firmament? Well, the waters. Well, you might consider that the entire known universe that we look out with telescopes of various kinds, you may say, well, what's outside the universe? Well, maybe it's a firmament with waters out there. Or I'll say, well, okay, what happened to those waters above? Why doesn't the space shuttle go through the waters above when the space shuttle doesn't go to the moon? I've said that before, which is a really dumb thing to say. Why didn't the Apollo mission have to go through the waters above? Because people say, well, the waters above are the clouds. No, the waters above are, they wouldn't, that's not what they're talking about with the waters above. So again, right away, this literal language gets us into trouble. And it doesn't get us into these words that fudge. These are so hard. So then I'll just throw illustrations at people, and I'll say things like, okay, so you're demanding a biblical cosmology. Are you insisting on a biblical anatomy? Or do you go to a doctor who has refused all modern science and has only studied the Bible in order to know what it is you learn, or what it is you need to know about the human body? Now, I haven't found anyone who does that, at least nobody living, and that might be telling. Why? Because this word literal, it is not doing for you what you want it to do for you. So let's get back to the question. How could this person talk to his family? Well, let's use this illustration of Tolkien, and if you ask Frodo, okay, let's say Frodo is down with the existence of Tolkien. Where is Tolkien's house? Tolkien's house, apparently, when he was writing The Lord of the Rings, was on Northmoor Road. And, here it is. Here's Tolkien's house. Could Frodo get to Tolkien's house from Middle-earth? how far from Middle Earth was Tolkien's house? Well, you might say, Tolkien's house wasn't far at all from Middle Earth. Frodo was practically a member of that family. Was Frodo in the house? And you can see right away that this word literal isn't going to help you much, because you could, at least in this physical space that we share, we could go over, if we were living a number of years ago, and touch Tolkien. When we touched Tolkien, were we touching Frodo or Gandalf? See, right away you begin to realize that the tools that we're bringing to the problem, the tools that we're bringing to the situation, are not helping us. And you begin to understand why the LDS Church imagined God on a planet, because they were trying to put their God in the universe, to have their God be a living God that could in fact relate to them, and they could in fact inhabit it. Way early on, when I started getting into the Jordan Peterson thing, the reason was I saw that what Peterson was helping with, and then through Peterson I found Pajot, and I know a lot of you, through Peterson you found me, or through Peterson you found Pajot and then me. The thing that Peterson was helping with is the divided world. And this has been something that I've been thinking about for a very long time. And I've been thinking about it because of the difficulty of these kinds of conversations. And I've been convinced for a very long time that this is a philosophical, linguistic dilemma that we're in as a result of this whole history. Now, Jonathan Pajot is worshiping with people who have not been tremendously subject to this history. And as Jonathan says later in the video, those who have been educated, well, educated, we like to use educated as some kind of a nebulous term. You're always educated into something. You are, and as C.S. Lewis, Tim Keller, many have said, when you convert, it's not that you abandon beliefs, you just change beliefs. And a lot of people like to imagine when they leave Christianity, they're out into the blue sky, real world. It's just as much a constructed world as the world you are living in. It just has different constructs and different ideas. So, what does it mean? How do you answer your Mormon parents about what you believe? Well, we've been wrestling with this since the Reformation, because how is Jesus Christ present in the Lord's Supper or Eucharist, or as the Roman Catholics call it, the host? John Calvin said he's spiritually present. Why did John Calvin say that? Because the underpinnings of these conversations were already happening, and we were already figuring out the power we could have when we would walk through some of the stuff that, for example, VanderKlay was walking through when he talked about Aristotle. Okay, how is Jesus present at the Lord's Supper? The Protestant Reformation split the church over this. Now, a lot of people will say, well, I don't have a problem. He's there spiritually. Wonderful. That works. What do you mean by it? Well, that's when they're going to start to stumble. So, this Mormon young person is obviously wrestling with matters of faith. And I would say, well, Frodo, in a sense, goes to live with Tolkien. What do you mean Frodo goes to live with Tolkien? How could that happen? Well, you would need someone who has mastery over the physical world in a way that Tolkien does not. Tolkien is merely a sub-creator, okay? And Tolkien is not the sub-creator, is not the creator of this physical space. And that's where the word physical is really helpful here. Because if someone says literal, I'll say, do you mean physical? Oh yeah, what do you mean by physical? That which is subject to, let's take a nod to Matt Dillahunty, the laws of physics. Okay, but what are the laws of physics? Well, they're patterns. They're patterns that express themselves in matter. Again, Go watch that Aristotle video. They express themselves in matter. Then you have to ask, well, where do these patterns come from? They come from its author. So, where is heaven? It's where the author lives. Well, what do you mean lives? Do you mean he has a body? No. It's where the author lives. That's the only way we can, that is the best way that we can conceive of it. Again, go back to that Aristotle, and we want the gestalt of bird. And if you haven't watched that video, you're going to have to watch that video probably to understand this. We have the gestalt of bird. And you say, well, explain that to me. Well, here, wait a second. I'll do it in one word. Bird. Well, that's unsatisfying. Yeah, but it's the best we can do. Because we are not gods over this gestalt that we're living in. Now, suddenly some of you are going to hear the simulation argument back there. Yeah, the simulation argument is kind of the cosmological argument. It's saying we're living in a world that has a creator. It's not base reality. What do you mean by base reality? Well, there's another metaphor. Well, no, base reality would be literal. Yeah, but it's all patterns all the way down. We don't get beyond the patterns. We can't, because we're part of it. But we have tremendous power over things, and we can conceptualize we can conceptualize things about this world that are really powerful. Yeah, we can, and that's really cool. But again, going back to that video, we can't make it. Someone might be able to describe a chair. They might take a ruler and a scale, and they might probe it and find out the elements that are used in the making of that chair. Someone might do so. Well, let's use my handy little cell phone stand. They might describe this, and well, we made it. But here's the thing: we can't make life. Well, why not? Even if we manage to make life by trying to reverse engineer the living things we saw now, we still wouldn't be masters of it the way the master of life, this anti-entropy envelope, did for us. See, the problem is that we have biases, and when we start talking that way, if there is a master of life, might we owe this master of life something? And we don't like to be in debt. So, words that fudge, literal, avoid it. And when I say avoid it, because you'll hear me use the word literal, and you'll hear me use the word spiritual, what I mean by that is don't use these words without pausing and thinking and maybe trying to find a better word. Use physical, perhaps. Or someone asked me to identify the story verse. I, Paul VanderKlay, am as much a story as I am a body. And in fact, I would argue I'm much more easily a story than a body, because now, is the story dependent on the body? Well, is a marriage dependent on the body of the two participants? Does a marriage exist literally? Does a marriage exist physically? Does a marriage govern? Is a marriage real? When is a marriage real? When is a marriage most real? A marriage is most real when it's governing not just two individuals, but it's governing, in fact, marriages can govern entire nations. Why was Henry VIII so worried about his marriages, or not worried? Why were those marriages so important? That idea, this thing, marriage, was governing all of Europe. Is marriage real? Literally.